Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Professor Jisung Park and Professor Robert Frank. Thanks for joining us tonight. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 300 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. Robert Frank is the H.J. Lewis Professor Emeritus of Management and Professor Emeritus of Economics at Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management and a Distinguished Senior Fellow at Demos. For more than a decade, his Economic View column appeared monthly in the New York Times. He has written many books, including The Darwin Economy, Success and Luck, and The Winner-Take-All Society. FAN hosted Professor Frank in 2022 for his book, Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work, and we are honored to welcome him back. Jisung Park is assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds appointments in the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Wharton School of Business. An environmental and labor economist, he has been investigating and writing about the economics of climate change for more than a decade. Professor Park's research combines data, quasi-experimental methods, and economic analysis to better understand the implications of environmental change for human flourishing and how effective policy responses may be designed. Ongoing work examines such topics as the effects of extreme heat on workers and labor market inequality, the consequences of natural disasters for human capital, and the process by which workers and firms adapt to a changing environment. And now let's welcome Professor Jisung Park and Professor Robert Frank.
Thanks, Lonnie. I was delighted when you invited me to help moderate this session. I don't think I would have found out about slow burn nearly as quickly, except for your invitation. And I read it quickly and enjoyed it enormously. I immediately wrote Jisung a note congratulating him on what a fine piece of work it was. It's remarkable, not just for the technical wizardry that underlies his estimates of the current costs of warming that the planet is experiencing, but also for the fact that, unlike most of our fellow economists, he managed to avoid the temptation to let the technique dimension of the work overshadow everything else. He has gone and constructed a very cogent, accessible narrative, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about it as we get started, and then we'll have some questions and discussion. So go ahead, Jisung.
Great. Well, Bob, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to Lonnie and everyone at FAN for putting this together, and thanks to all of you for joining us. That's very kind of you. In some ways, the book is really a reflection of both my own sort of wandering in the weeds, the sort of data-heavy weeds of what you might call climate econometrics, right? Where myself and many other researchers are beginning to use both sort of big data and these quasi-experimental econometric techniques to really try to better understand what you might call the more subtle dimensions of climate change, the hidden ways in which even moderate amounts of climate change, far from the end of century catastrophe scenarios, may already be affecting health, well-being, productivity, etc. So that's really the heart of the book, and trying to unpack, what that means for how we think about climate change, what that means for how we think about other ostensibly potentially unrelated issues like economic inequality or education. That's the motivation behind the book. I will say, Bob, it's a reflection not only of my own research, but really what has been an explosion of empirical social scientific research, including among environmental economists, on this issue of climate change, that takes a step away from the more theoretical aspect and really tries to focus in on, well, what can the data tell us about what even moderate amounts of warming is already doing to the many facets of our economy that make it run. And so the book was motivated, again, to try to provide an accessible account of that for those who don't, get out of bed thinking I want to read 50 pages about, econometric equations.
I think the the idea that the real threats from climate change, like the catastrophic rises in sea level that were going to occur 100 years from now when the Greenland ice sheet melts, that's just too far away for most people
Right.
to feel an immediate connection to. And behavioral science has long stressed that people are quite bad at weighing future costs and benefits against costs and benefits that occur right now. There's the great Roald Dahl Veruca Salt quote from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. She shouts, "I want it now." We know we should exercise more and eat more prudently, but the gains from those things don't come for a while, and the pleasures of the alternatives are right away. So yeah, that was I think one of the main theories for why we weren't taking action. And I took, you didn't state this quite explicitly, but I took one of your motives in writing the book to be that, yes, those costs are far away, but there are enormous underappreciated costs that are occurring as we speak. And your book really does bring the reality of that fact home very forcefully to readers. I thought that was a real achievement. And you do talk about policy. I know as economists, we teach our students that the reason we have a warming crisis in the first place is that it's cheap to produce with processes that emit a lot of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. It costs money to filter them out. We don't pay any penalty at all for emitting them. The costs of them fall mostly on everyone else, just a tiny fraction. And so the standard remedy is a carbon tax, a tax that would force users to confront the full cost that they're imposing on society when they use things.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that you're strongly in favor, from what you've written, of a tax like that. And I know many countries have adopted such measures already. Why do you think here in the United States we've been so resistant to doing that?
Great questions, Bob. Actually, there were a couple questions there. Let me start with the first, a point on the first, which has to do with the long run catastrophe versus the sort of what I'm calling the slow burn, right? The here and now impacts. I just want to, and for sure, I will get to the carbon tax point because, I mean, you have two economists on stage. How long does it take before we talk about a carbon tax? We're both in agreement, and I have a lot to say about that. But one of the important points that I think, I don't want to say is missing from the debate, but could use more underlining, is this notion that there are multiple mental heuristics with which we might want to think about climate change. One of them is as a form of catastrophe insurance in a highly uncertain world, right? Given the possibility that, as you mentioned, things like the Greenland ice sheet melting might happen, the AMOC current destabilization might happen, and the potential long run, potentially catastrophic consequences of, warming that leads to those kinds of physical damages. That's a pretty good reason, one would imagine, to act aggressively in mitigating emissions, the same way we take out insurance against, low probability or uncertain probability, but potentially very high damage situations in life insurance, home insurance, etc. That's been the dominant narrative around why we should act on climate change. In the book, I tried to sort of highlight not an alternative, but a complementary additional way to think about climate change, which is as sort of this, again, slower burning crisis that is less about is the world as a whole, is humanity as a whole, at risk of going extinct, but rather what are the marginal diminutions to our quality of life, our livelihood, and in some cases our actual health and ability to live on this planet? How are those things affected by so-called non-catastrophic amounts of warming, right? I'm not talking about what happens in a 4 or 5 degree world. I'm talking about, what happens in a 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 degree world, which, by the way, in some parts of the world mean, 50, maybe even 100 additional days per year with temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, just to pick an somewhat arbitrary threshold. So that's kind of to your point about how we think about climate change, the long run nature of it. It's worth bearing in mind that there are very good reasons to think about it as sort of a averting long run catastrophe. But I also want to highlight, this additional way of thinking about it, especially given sort of the behavioral biases, right, that many of us humans have. I guess that dovetails well into your question about the carbon tax. Putting a price on carbon, which is, as the late and great environmental economist Marty Weissman once put it, the mother of all externality problems. I think almost every economist would agree that's, excuse me, a very sensible idea, right? One of the appealing aspects of it is that instead of policing or relying on everyone to share a common set of values around why we want to protect polar bears or why we want to, insure against disaster for future generations, just building into the machinery of the economy a price signal, right? So that every time you face a decision, should I buy an electric vehicle for my, for a new vehicle or a conventional gas engine? Should I, install a new air conditioner that's more efficient or not? All of these decisions have baked into them a favoring of those that are less climate damaging than those that are more greenhouse gas intensive. I think that's a much more elegant way to solve the issue than perhaps other tools. I would love to get into a discussion about, the pros and cons of the tools, but your question was about why we don't have a carbon tax. And I guess there, I'm a little bit out of my depth. I'm not a political scientist. I can guess as to why, it's so difficult to get something like a carbon tax on the books in the United States. I mean, tax is always a four-letter word, I guess, but as you mentioned, there are carbon taxes in place in other countries. One of the things that I think is perhaps worth stressing here and maybe of interest to, our audience is that even the carbon taxes that are in place in countries like Sweden or the UK, although I'm not remembering whether the UK actually has a carbon tax, but in the countries that have a carbon tax, the latest estimates of the damages from so-called non-catastrophic climate change suggest that even those levels are probably lower than what would be ideal from society's standpoint. So just to give you a number, right? The EPA's latest estimates that synthesize at least part of the new data that is summarized in my book, they suggest that every ton of carbon emitted puts in motion something on the order of $190 of damages to us and to future generations around the world. And so, if you read that number literally, the implication is that the carbon tax should be at least $190 per ton. That I don't think there are many, if any, countries that have that aggressive a level of carbon pricing.
There aren't, and in fact, I think that's probably the greatest single example of political malpractice I can think of, that we haven't adopted measures of that extreme sort. And I think the behavioral economics movement has a little bit of interesting stuff to say about what the barriers have been. We are loss averse in the behavioral economists parlance. We will work a lot harder to avoid a $10 loss than we will to acquire a $10 gain. And so a tax is almost invariably coded as a loss. There are benefits from the tax, obviously. We avoid some of these other costs, but they're much less in plain view. Yet there's a simple step that political leaders could have taken that I think would have made a carbon tax enormously appealing to 90% of all voters. And the idea is simple. It's that the greenhouse gas emissions around the world, Oxfam has shown to be highly concentrated among top earners. The top 10% of earners emit 50% of all greenhouse gases. That means, of course, they would pay in the lion's share of the revenue from a carbon tax. We could rebate that revenue in monthly cash payments in a very progressive way so that 90% of all voters would get more back each month than they paid in carbon tax, completely eliminating the loss aversion problem. And then if we want to take a vote, the 10% at the top who are going to be paying a lot more in tax because of a carbon tax, well, they've got 10% of the votes. Let's just outvote them. But it wouldn't even be unfair to do that because it's their property. It's their mansions that are falling off the cliffs into the sea that would be protected by the measures we would achieve if we had implemented a tax like that. So I think
Totally.
we as economists have to be much more forceful advocates and effective advocates for this key measure. It gets brought up, it gets rejected, it gets brought up. We got to get in there and fight a better fight on that one is my view. But let me stop editorializing.
Bob, I couldn't agree more. And I'll just sneak one last point in before you move on to the next question, which is, I think I totally agree that we owe it to our fellow citizens to do a better job of explaining that can work. Because I think, to give you an example, when I talk about carbon tax and rebate in my classes at UPenn, I'm often met with a little bit of sort of, but how could that really work? You're taxing us and then you're giving the money back. How is that actually going to help solve the problem of climate change? And then you have to go through, right? We have to talk through why it is that changing one particular aspect of the economy, namely how carbon intensive everything is, and taxing the things that are more carbon intensive shifts our behavior, even if on net, right, we're not actually paying into the government. We're not forking over our hard-earned cash, right, to Uncle Sam. But I totally agree. I mean, that's the piece of the debate that perhaps is worth revisiting. I will say, maybe this is my perennially optimistic nature. Or maybe it's just because I haven't been around enough years in life, but I am optimistic that we finally, I don't want to say won the battle, but the tide is moving in the right direction in terms of the general public understanding that climate change is a problem worth acting on. So clearing the bar of this is a policy problem worth caring about. In terms of the problem of instrument choice, right? Which policy levers are best suited to solve this problem that we've agreed is an issue? I think it's something that we're going to continue to need to fight the good fight on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, good points. I think that the idea that it was going to be too late to solve the climate crisis was almost as big an obstacle to action as the perception that none of the policies would work or that we didn't even have a problem. The main problem initially was that so many people denied that it was even happening. And if there was a silver lining to all the floods and droughts and wildfires and other disasters we've had that are weather-related in recent decades, is that it's kind of drowned out the denialists as a force against taking action. But what about the claim that it's too late? Even if we did everything possible now, I know from having read your book that you don't believe it's too late. Can you give listeners a sense of why you don't think that?
Absolutely. The book is actually not intended for anyone who has an inkling of climate denialism. It actually just takes as premise that climate change is happening. It's if anything, intended more for the people who are growing quickly in number, who are so concerned and anxious about climate change, perhaps to the point of feeling depressed, fatalistically kind of trapped in the sense that we've crossed the irreversible threshold and it's too late. I was reading a survey of young people, 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 different countries, including the US, the UK, Nigeria, India. And something like 45% of the respondents responded that they have felt so anxious about climate change that it negatively affected their day-to-day functioning. To me, that's an alarming number, in the sense that while it is absolutely true, and I hope I make it clear in the book that climate change is a very serious issue with immense social costs, the data doesn't appear to suggest that, we've somehow crossed the point of no return where humanity is doomed. To be fair, I have to note that the climate science literature does suggest that there are some tipping points that we may already be at risk of crossing, especially around things like, bleaching of coral reefs eventually, and other sort of slow-moving processes that once you pass a certain amount of warming, they sort of kick into gear and may have important ecological implications. But the reason why in the book I argue that not all is lost and that actually the climate catastrophe framing, if ingested in isolation, may actually be potentially counterproductive, is the fact that, to use sort of a medical analogy, it's probably really helpful to kind of jolt us out of our complacency by warning us that, hey, you keep this up, you may have a heart attack and you may die. But in order to motivate the sustained action of change, I think you need, and this is sort of me being an armchair psychologist, but personally, I think you need a sense of positive agency. So maybe the analogy here is, right, in order to motivate you continuing to take your medication, to do the exercise, to eat right, that's going to require sustained will. And just scaring you to death, I don't know if that's conducive to that. It may be for some. But I think what I wanted to highlight in the book, again, without downplaying the very real risks that exist, is this fact that, acting on climate change is a dial, not a switch, right? It's not as if, hey, we acted on climate change, we solved it, or we didn't. It's actually the case. This is what the data suggests, that every incremental amount of warming has very deleterious consequences that increasingly we're able to measure. The flip side of that, in my opinion, is that every increment of warming we prevent, i.e., every ton of CO2 that we prevent from going into the atmosphere, whether that's through our own consumption activities or helping to elect politicians who will, enact something like a carbon tax or other policy measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Every time we do that, we are actually moving in the right direction, and there are tangible, measurable gains from that. And that this can be quantified in dollars, it can be quantified in lives, lives saved. And so that, again, without trying to be Pollyannish about the risks, I think it is important that because it is going to be such a long haul, I think personally it's important that the citizenry in a democracy are armed with the information that allows us to say, okay, like, yes, there are these risks of catastrophe, but every time we take a step, to reduce emissions, we're averting this amount of damages. And also, by the way, we've made a lot of progress. We can talk about that if we have time as well. It's probably not enough, certainly not enough, but in the last decade or so, the projections around how much warming we are expected to experience in the next century, less than a century, end of century, have gone down from, between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius to something more like 1.8 and 3 degrees Celsius. Now, that's still an uncomfortably high and large range, but that's progress. And I think you can only build on progress and sustain it with that sense that, again, we're making strides in the right direction. Not all is lost.
I know you and I both read David Wallace Wells's book when it came out, Life After Warming. If I recall, the first sentence verbatim, it reads something like, "It's worse, much worse than you think." And I had been doing a lot of research in this area and thought I knew the literature well, but I was alarmed deeply after reading the book, and came to believe that it was really much worse than I thought. Why have the estimates that it's not as bad as Wells thought then been revised downward? Is it that we have better understanding of the processes that are in play here, or is it a consequence of actual measures that we've taken that are having an effect? I know the proportion of CO2 in the air has not gone down
Right.
since the book was published. Why have people gotten more optimistic about the future trajectory?
Yeah, that's a great question. My understanding is that there's still a debate, Bob, around why exactly, the projections have gone down. But to the best of my knowledge, it seems to be a combination of the two. It seems to be a combination of both a revised understanding of where we were headed in the first place, what population trends are looking like, what technological trends, phase out of coal, et cetera, are looking like, just in sort of a secular sense. Plus the actions we have taken on the policy front, as well as the pledges that we've made in terms of concrete policies to reduce emissions. So, sorry, let me be very crystal clear. There are pledges to reduce emissions that are not the same thing as legislation that reduces emissions, but on both counts, there has been significant progress over the past, say, decade. I mean, I think the biggest case in point is something that depends on who you ask, but in my opinion, sort of flew under the radar a little bit, was the Inflation Reduction Act. Yes, it is not a carbon tax, it's more a package of subsidies, but it is arguably the biggest piece of climate legislation in the United States history. Probably doesn't get us any more than halfway there in terms of the emissions cuts that many, I think, would agree are necessary. But it gets us, it's like a big down payment.
Yeah,
and it's nothing to sneeze at. And we can, I think reasonable minds can disagree about, whether again, subsidies are better than taxes, or better than cap and trade, is better than a mandate. But just in terms of the extent and magnitude of the political will and the actions that has led to, yeah, there has been a change over the past several years.
And the changes have been quite dramatic in some places. I know that the subsidies have been credited with the initiation of the steep plunge in costs for renewables. I mean, we learned by doing, and we wouldn't have been doing except for the subsidies in the first place. And
Yes.
now, I mean, look at a state like Texas. There's no legislature anywhere in the country that's more hostile to renewables than the Texas legislature. They're pure fossil fuel advocates, all of them, almost all of them. And yet Texas generates more energy from wind and solar than any other state by a wide margin. And that's just because it's so much cheaper to generate the power that way.
Absolutely. I think something like a 60 to 70% reduction in the cost of wind over the last decade,
More.
upwards of, maybe even more than that. Yeah. And the cost of solar has fallen by even more than that. Lithium batteries, right? Absolutely.
It feels like a luxury for me to have a climate expert available to answer these questions that have been bothering me for so long. And one of them concerns attitudes toward carbon capture. The Inflation Reduction Act invests pretty heavily in research to advance techniques for capturing carbon out of the air. The most optimistic estimates I've seen are that it will cost within a decade $100 per ton to get carbon out of the air using these methods. That's 40 times as expensive as the cost of filtering existing emissions out of the emission stream. So we can add insulation to a house and cut carbon emissions by $15 a ton that way. So it's nowhere near enough to compete with the existing methods of reducing current emissions. But why is it then, even though it can't be economical to do it as the cheapest way to reduce emission, the IPCC says, well, even so, there are many emissions we can never reduce or eliminate all the way down to zero, and we'll have to find ways to remove existing CO2 from the atmosphere if we're ever going to achieve a stable atmosphere in the future. So why is it that the climate advocates, so many of them, get angry at the mere mention of carbon capture? They really seem to have a thing about it.
I wish I could tell you why they get angry, but let me tell you this, Bob. At the risk of being a little bit pedantic, but telling you something you know very well, right? I think this discussion and this question really, to me, underscores the value and the need of having a quantitatively disciplined and empirically based way of thinking about how serious a problem climate change is. Let me unpack what I mean by that. We see stories about what a world, with 4 degrees of warming, 5 degrees of warming might look like, uninhabitable cities, what happens to coastlines when the Greenland ice sheet melts. In a qualitative sense, is that scary? Is that not? Well, what I'm getting at is how much we are willing to spend as a society to reduce emissions, whether we are willing to spend $100 plus per ton CO2 captured using carbon capture and storage, should, in the economist's opinion, be a function, right, of how costly is it to not do that? As in, what are the damages that you're avoiding?
Exactly.
This is what I mean by a quantitatively disciplined way of thinking about climate change. The social cost of carbon is one concept, probably the main concept that we as economists use to try to, as a barometer, right, for how serious of a problem is it and how much we should be willing to pay. It's sort of also a kind of a litmus test. Okay, like if the technology costs less than the social cost of carbon as we understand it to be, probably worth doing. So in that sense, I think the fact that under the Obama administration, before we were able to include some of the more recent research, both in terms of what kinds of damages occur from climate change, but also around discounting, et cetera. When we thought the social cost of carbon was something like $50 a ton, carbon capture and storage, I think, maybe didn't make sense. But if we think we are in a world where emitting an additional ton of CO2 causes $190 of damages, and it's a range, but that's a central estimate.
Yeah.
So it could be much more than that. And tipping points aren't even included in this. So then it might, then the sort of cost benefit way of thinking about it would suggest, yes, you should do carbon capture as well. Of course, ideally, you would line up all of the ways to reduce emissions, by order of cheapness and ease of doing so, and knock out the cheap things first. But in a real sense, if things take time to develop from a technological standpoint and to implement, it could make sense to do many things at once. I was trying to think of a metaphor for this. I don't know if this works. Bob, maybe you can tell me if it does, but it's sort of like if someone comes to your door and says, we're going on a camping trip, it's an unknown duration. You got to pack your bags. If you think it's just going to be a day hike, maybe you just pack a water bottle and some apples and a sandwich. If you think it's going to be, 6 months in the wilderness, you're going to pack everything in the fridge. You're going to take a lot of time to pack it. Again, not exactly the right metaphor, but again, depending on how how long and serious a journey we think it's going to be in terms of reducing emissions, how worthwhile that is. You may want to pack. You may even want to bring the refrigerator, right? So that's the sense in which the seriousness of climate change, I think, dictates the costliness of the technologies that we are willing to entertain as part of the solution set. I think a quantitatively disciplined answer to the question 10 years ago was maybe not, but given recent evidence, I would argue, yeah, it should be part of the solution set as well.
Yeah, it seems so to me clearly part of any reasonable solution, that the mystery is to understand why other people who claim to be climate advocates are so firmly rooted against it. The only explanation I've heard is that they're fearful that if we talk about technological solutions to warming, that will blunt people's willingness to accept sacrifices, to adopt other policies that clearly we do need to adopt too. There's some magic bullet, we'll put mirrors up in the atmosphere and solve it at low cost that way. So I appreciate that that's a concern. You don't want to mislead people into abandoning their sense of urgency, but given that you can get it out of the air for $100 a ton, that seems like a reasonable estimate. And given that it's uniformly distributed in the air all around the Earth, you can put the machines that suck carbon out of the air in deserts and other places that aren't of any value. What's the downside? I'm so puzzled by that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I never actually thought of it that way. So kind of what you're saying, Bob, is if to the extent that, your theory of change in either direction, good or bad, includes, if you ascribe to a techno-optimistic reasoning, I'm worried about that in general. As if carbon capture and storage is part of that, well, maybe that leads to solar radiation management and so-called geoengineering the earth as a solution. Yeah, I think that makes more sense than I thought it would. Hearing you say it. I will say though, given the cheapness of many of the other technologies that are available to reduce emissions, I do sometimes worry about the maybe this is harsh, but the kind of technology fetish of, say, Silicon Valley, of, the silver bullet technology is going to solve this. All we really need to do is come up with that. The evidence to me suggests that this is too risky of a problem to rely only on that, and also that we have proven and economical technologies already that are just waiting for policy action to incentivize.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no conceivable argument against taking steps that can get carbon out for $15 a ton.
Right.
Once you've used those up, we need more. And I think the case for acting on those other methods now is that we want to develop them and get the costs down. And the sooner we get carbon out of the air by whatever means available, the better.
Bingo.
For the reasons you've nicely outlined in your book. Okay, we got a little bit more time. I wanted to mention one thing that is of concern to me that you didn't touch much on in the book. How will I put it? I live in Ithaca, New York, which for people who don't know it is a cold place, relatively speaking. I would say that global warming, as we've experienced it here, has either been a neutral phenomenon or even a small net positive. The winters are less punishing, and yet for some reason the summers haven't gotten noticeably worse, and we've gotten even rainfall patterns and so on. So here we are. Personally, I don't feel any threat from climate change in these circumstances, and yet I feel enormously threatened by it because I feel like the risk has never been higher that I will someday soon live under an authoritarian government. The the failed half the population of the South is one bad harvest away from starvation. These bad harvests come frequently, ever more frequently. They're refugees. They've got nowhere to go but north. And the political reaction to these migrations has been explosively harmful, it seems like to me.
Yeah.
So that I think is at least another important reason for acting quickly on all of this.
I couldn't agree more, Bob. That is something that I thought about a little. I mentioned a little bit in the book, but I really don't expand upon this intersection, right, of the geopolitical consequences of the social economic upheaval created by climate change. Yeah, that's something that is certainly a concern. I mean, there is evidence increasingly that actually suggests that violent conflict, both of the micro and macro variety, is already triggered on the margin by hotter temperature to start, and then possibly also by drought. This is not exactly what you were saying, but it's something that I was, as part of the research for the book, I was intrigued by, which is this pretty clear connection between hotter temperature and local crime rates, to a significant extent. But there are studies that show that crime in your zip code increases on a hot day, and hot doesn't have to be 100 degrees, 85, 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That even violence within prisons spikes on hotter days, especially those prisons that don't seem to have air conditioning. So, multiple layers there in terms of the potential ramifications for what it means to live in a safe environment and without conflict. Again, both interpersonal but also potentially international. Without wading too far into the political side of the spectrum, I mean, what we've seen in many countries around the world, in terms of the shift toward what is arguably authoritarian-esque governments, is concerning to me, and certainly in a world where you have more climate refugees, more climate-related instability. Yeah, that link seems definitely worth thinking about. And then those links aren't yet, to my knowledge, fully reflected into, say, the EPA's estimates of what the social costs of carbon are. So if you think those things matter, then the urgency is even more.
Well, everything clearly matters. I think if we want to talk about a social cost, we can't leave any of that out.
Yes, absolutely.
I was really pleased that your book gave such keen attention to inequality's role in all of this. I think that's a missing dimension from many of the discussions of these problems that are out there. So if you, in the time we have left, want to say anything about what some of the linkages are between inequality and who gets hurt and what actions we take in response.
Sure thing. So I imagine that many on this call are familiar with this idea that climate change, has important implications for how we think about international inequality, right? Global North, global South, to state the obvious. As you mentioned earlier, right, would you say the top 10% of earners emit 50% of emissions? I would imagine that if you looked cumulatively over the span of human history in terms of our use of carbon intensive fuels, it may be even higher. Maybe that was the number. But the point is that richer developed economies, individuals in those economies have emitted on a per person basis way more than, say, someone in Bangladesh or India or even Brazil. And yet, most of the projections we see suggest that for any given amount of average warming for the globe, how that translates into potential human suffering is sort of stacked in a way that is unequal across countries, the global South. To start, just by sheer volume of hotter days that the Indias and Bangladesh of the world will experience. Thailand could see 100 additional days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit just by 2030. 2050, 2060, right? That aspect of climate change and inequality is probably not too new. Without suggesting that what the book offers is new, I wanted to highlight, though, a sort of additional aspect, which one might call interpersonal inequality, even within countries, and how that matters here. What the data and the methods that I briefly touch on in the book have allowed us to do, one of the things is provide an increasingly nuanced picture of who it is within a given society that is more likely to be adversely affected from climate change and how. Just to give you one example that is closer to home for us in the US. So roughly 100 million adults in the US do not have a bachelor's degree. 70-ish% of those individuals report routine exposure to harsh environmental conditions on the job. So these are not office workers, right? We're talking about construction workers, manufacturing, transportation, warehousing. And in some of the research that my colleagues and I have done, we find that actually, even in the United States, going to work on a hot-ish day, I'm not even going to say very hot day, 85 degrees, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, can increase the risk of serious accident or injury on the job by anywhere between 5 and 50% on that day for workers, particularly in highly exposed industries. That divide is very starkly drawn between those with and without access to higher education, and income lines are similar as well. And so that's just one example of how even within a given country, the effects of climate change are likely to be very different across the income and skills distribution. I think it's also important to bear in mind that climate change is happening amid a backdrop of what is in many countries persistently high and often rapidly rising income inequality. Again, between the educational haves and have-nots, those that are more able to plug into the modern globalized, technology economy. In some cases, that means life or death. In others, it's just a matter of, a diminution in quality of life. But in any event, if we care about, again, sustaining political will for emissions reductions, and also just thinking about fairness, who's caused the problem, who will suffer. One could argue that, it makes a lot of sense to bear these lines of inequality in mind as we think about both the problem of climate change, how bad it is, but also, what we're willing to do for it.
Yeah, it's the people at the bottom who are bearing the bulk of the costs. They can't adapt nearly as well as you and I can. I liked your illustration of the different tiers in the Amazon.com workforce.
Right.
The people in the high end don't get exposed to any of this. The people at the bottom end get exposed to it in spades.
Yes.
It's a really and the political problem this poses seems to me serious too, and worthy of more attention than it's gotten. The victims are the ones with the least voice in the political system. Those of us who can adapt and escape the suffering don't have as nearly as strong an incentive to complain that action be taken, and yet at the same time we're the ones who have to be taxed in order to pay for the action that needs to be taken.
Yes. And
so I think that's a problem that really does require much more attention from our profession. How do we sell the people that need to be taxed to pay for the solutions that it's in their interest to take these steps? They can take private measures to escape much of the damage, so they're tempted to say, well, why should I care? I want to respond that people in that stratum, what are they worried about if we're going to tax them to pay for these measures? Nobody's proposed a tax that will threaten their ability to buy anything anybody might be reasonably said to need, that their needs are well attended to.
Right.
What are they worried about? Their ability to buy luxuries. And here I think we just need to explain to them that that ability isn't threatened at all if they all pay higher taxes.
That's right.
There are only so many penthouse apartments overlooking Central Park. The players all want them. How do they get them? They have to outbid others in their income block to get possession of them. And
I see what you're saying. Yep.
and if my taxes go up and my rival's taxes go up, the keys to that apartment end up in the same hands as before. So I think the resistance of the wealthy to higher taxes is really just based on a fundamental failure to understand the logic of how markets work. They're not in any way threatened. We know that when all the mansions get 10% bigger, nobody living in them gets either healthier or happier than before.
Fair point.
It just shifts the bar that defines what they think they need. So it would be utterly painless to solve these problems, and yet people don't know that. And I think that's a huge shortcoming of our profession, that we haven't made that clear to people.
I couldn't agree more. And by the way, even though the Inflation Reduction Act was, such a big deal and a big step in the right direction, again, still not enough. So whatever round two ends up being, it will require the buy-in of the polity and the understanding of why, we need this, and also that it's not necessarily as costly or zero sum as our loss-averse minds may make it seem.
Exactly. Now, Lonnie was going to tell me if there were pressing questions she wanted to feed me. I see that she has again appeared on the screen. Probably she's going to tell us something, but not that.
I am going to tell you something. I'm actually going to announce something. We have so loved this conversation. Jisung, we are so impressed by you. Bob, we love you. So Jisung, you got to get up to the level of love. Right now, we're just impressed.
Does that happen when I come back with the second book? How does
You're at a great start. So what we've decided to do, Fan wants to do just up the ante here on coming to after hours, as many know, and we've been putting in commercials in chat. So if you're here and you haven't open up chat right now. Usually you get to come to after hours by buying a copy of the book, and then you get a receipt from our bookseller, and it has the link to register for after hours. Fan's going to sweeten that pot. We want to do a buy one, get one free. So what we're going to do is buy a copy of Jisung's book, come to after hours, and you will be gifted a second copy of the book to give to a teacher, a relative, your child, a friend,
fabulous.
A brother, a sibling, someone. So we really want to make sure that we can do at least our part a bit to try to get this book into more hands, double your funds, so to speak. So we call it a BOGO. So it's a buy one, get one free. We're going to be doing it tonight. You got to come to after hours. You can't just buy a book. We're not just going to automatically send you 2 copies. Buy a book, come to after hours, and we'll be putting a link in the after hours chat to claim your second copy. So
what a great move.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that. There is
awesome.
I'm sorry, go ahead. What were you gonna say, Jisung?
I just said that's awesome.
Our pleasure. Really, it's such thoughtful, great work. And Bob, I want to first compliment you on what a lovely interview. You just walked folks through, kept everything super accessible. And of course, you have such great, as even on ending in your final point here about why don't people understand more? I mean, I think your arguments to me, a non-economist, not even a amateur one. I'm even whatever below amateur is what I am. I just find your arguments extremely persuasive, and I think that you just are so spot on so much of this. So I appreciate that you've brought that piece of you to the conversation as well, 100%. So here is there were a couple questions that came in. I want to look at Robin's question in particular. She says, it sounds like many things we typically think of as individual or personal variables, that is to say, academic scores, crime, conflict, accidents, anxiety, etc., are influenced by the slow burn. What can we do to help protect people from being, quote, burned, and to decrease the growing inequalities between people who are protected or even find climate change to be a relief, meaning less severe winters, and people who are suffering from climate change?
Great question. I'm looking at the clock. We only have what, 3 minutes?
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Let me try to be succinct. In all of the time we discussed, Bob, policy, we didn't get to talk as much about adaptation, which is essentially what is being asked in this great question. Interestingly here, and researchers will always say we need more research, we need more evidence, but in this case, I actually think it can be said that we know that adaptation can be effective along many margins. There's arguably less evidence as to what exact adaptations work best for whom and how we should coordinate that from a policy standpoint. There is some action at the federal level, at state levels. So for instance, I'm on the sort of heat advisory committee for the state of California, trying to think about how to design workplace protections against extreme heat. But often the devil is in the details. And unlike climate mitigation, which is a global negative externality problem, adaptation is more local. And so that's actually an area in which, educating ourselves, one, about the hazards that are most relevant to our local communities, and then two, trying to be proactive citizens in terms of making sure that our local politicians are aware of these issues, collaborating with local experts, whether it's in healthcare or academia or where have you, to see if you can tailor the combination of public intervention and private innovation and citizen engagement to develop the right cocktail of adaptation. But that's a really important area, much more localized solution set.
Did you want to add something, Bob?
Lottie, as you were reading the question, I was thinking immediately my answer would be tax me more heavily and invest more in mitigation and adaptation measures.
Well, maybe at after hours, it could be a little teaser for folks. So like, what are you guys gonna do at after hours besides hang out and ask all the good questions? Maybe we can take a look a little bit at some of the adaptation pieces for sure. I think that would be, given what some of the questions that were submitted through the Zoom registration form as well. The percent of people who might be here or who are interested in this topic, I admire that folks are, tell me one thing. Is there one thing you want me to do? What's one thing? Like, people want, they want solid, smart advice. They don't want to just take in and do nothing. And I realize that it could probably feel like, well, give you one thing to do, like the one thing to do. So I'm going to give folks a task here. Get a copy of Jisung's book, come to after hours, get a second copy of the book, and come and explore some of these topics with him. And with Bob as well. It's going to be a great conversation. I want to thank both gentlemen. We're at 8 o'clock, so we're going to stop now. We give them both a 5-minute break, so we'll be opening up the after hours room at approximately 8:05 Central. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. We hope to see a bunch of you in about 5 minutes. Thank you so much.